Look, I'm going to tell you a story that still makes me laugh so hard, I nearly spit out whatever I'm drinking, and I've told it at least 47 times. Maybe 48. I lost count after the third bar. The thing about humans is that they're absolute lunatics, right? Everyone in the galactic community knows this. We've established this fact. We've had conferences about it. There are support groups for species who've had to work alongside humans for extended periods. The Vrilnathi even have a 12-step program for survivors of human dinner parties, which apparently involves something called hot sauce challenges and trust falls. Don't ask. I made the mistake of asking once, and I still have nightmares about the explanation. But this story, oh, this story is special. This is about the day that Instructor Krell Voth, the most decorated weapons master in the Galactic Defense Coalition, learned a very important lesson about making assumptions. Specifically, making assumptions about a human woman named Dakota Reeves. Now, Krell Voth was what you might call traditionally impressive. He stood 9 feet tall, had 4 arms, each capable of bench pressing a small transport vehicle, scales that could deflect plasma rounds, and a collection of combat honors that would make a Spartan weep with envy. He'd trained elite soldiers from 14 different species. He'd fought in the Keltar Uprising, the Siege of Proxima, and that weird incident on Station Theta that nobody talks about, but everyone knows involved illegal cheese smuggling. The man, and I use that term loosely since he was more reptilian than anything, was a legend. Dakota Reeves, on the other hand, was 5'4", weighed maybe 120 pounds soaking wet, and showed up to her first day of advanced combat training carrying what appeared to be a piece of metal shaped vaguely like a sword that looked like it had been forged sometime around the Earth year 1200. I should mention that I was there. I'm Yaxtil, a Hiver, and I was part of the same training cohort. We Hivers aren't exactly known for our combat prowess. We're more the excellent at logistics and remembering where everyone parked their ships type. But the Coalition requires all member species to undergo basic combat certification, so there I was, trying not to faint every time someone swung a weapon in my general direction. The training hall on Outpost 17 was, in a word, intimidating. In several words, it was a massive dome filled with every type of weapon imaginable, holographic combat simulators, and enough sharp objects to make a safety inspector weep. The walls were lined with battle honors, dried bloodstains that had been left for motivation, and one inexplicable poster of a Earth cat hanging from a branch with text that read, "Hang in there." I never understood that one. There were 30 of us in that cohort. Vrilnathi warriors, a couple of Thex berserkers, even a Mindweaver, which was concerning because Mindweavers are essentially psychic combat specialists who can make you experience your own death 17 times before breakfast. And then there was Dakota, standing there in standard Coalition training gear, holding her ancient sword, looking like she'd accidentally wandered in from a Renaissance fair. Krell Voth entered the hall with the kind of presence that made everyone immediately stand straighter. His scales gleamed under the fluorescent lighting, his 4 arms crossed in what I'm pretty sure was the universal symbol for, "I'm about to make your life difficult." His eyes, all 3 of them, scanned the room with the kind of intensity usually reserved for predators selecting prey. "Welcome," he said, his voice like gravel being crushed in a blender, "to advanced combat certification. Some of you will pass. Most of you will fail. All of you will bleed." Encouraging stuff, really. Great motivational speaking. I immediately wanted to update my will. "You may have been competent in your respective militaries," he continued, pacing back and forth with the kind of swagger that suggested he'd never lost a fight and didn't plan to start now. "You may have won medals, earned commendations, survived battles. I don't care. In this hall, you are nothing. You will learn the right way to fight, or you will leave on a stretcher." One of the Thex berserkers growled appreciatively. Thex actually enjoy that kind of talk. It's like foreplay for them. Krell Voth's eyes landed on Dakota. All 3 of them. There was a long, uncomfortable pause. "Human," he said, and I swear I heard amusement in his voice. "What is that you're holding?" Dakota looked down at her sword, then back up at Krelvoth. It's called a katana, sir. It's a traditional weapon from my homeworld. Oh, the way he laughed. It wasn't a pleasant laugh. It was the kind of laugh that suggested he'd just been told a joke that wasn't funny, but he was going to laugh anyway to make a point. A sword, he said, uncrossing his arms. A primitive, chemical-forged piece of metal, and you brought it to an advanced weapons training course. Yes, sir. Are you aware, Krelvoth said, walking toward her with slow, deliberate steps, that we have plasma weapons, energy shields, molecular disruptors, weapons that can atomize targets from 3 kilometers away? I'm aware, sir. And you brought a sword. Yes, sir. The other trainees were starting to snicker. Even I, and I'm generally sympathetic to underdogs, thought Dakota might have made a tactical error. The Thex berserker next to me was openly laughing now. Krelvoth stopped directly in front of Dakota. He was literally twice her height. It was like watching a mountain confront a particularly determined pebble. Tell me, human, he said, his voice dripping with condescension, what exactly do you plan to do with that relic when facing an opponent with modern armor and weaponry? Dakota's expression didn't change. She didn't look intimidated. She didn't look angry. She just looked patient, like a teacher waiting for a particularly slow student to understand basic mathematics. I plan to win, sir. The laughter in the room got louder. Krelvoth's scales actually rippled, which I learned later was the equivalent of him being genuinely amused. Is that so? He turned to address the entire group. The human thinks she will win with a primitive blade. Perhaps we should test this theory. Oh no, I knew where this was going. I'd seen enough training vids to know that when an instructor singles someone out on day 1, it's about to become a teaching moment, and teaching moments always involve someone getting embarrassed. You, Krelvoth pointed at the largest Thex in the room, an absolute unit named Gormath, who looked like someone had tried to build a tank out of muscle and rage. Grab your weapon, full armor. Let's show our human friend what happens when antiquated methods meet modern combat. Gormath grinned, which on a Thex looks like someone opening a garage door full of knives. He grabbed his standard-issue Coalition combat axe, a nasty piece of work with plasma edges that could cut through hull plating, and headed to the armory for his combat suit. Dakota just stood there, holding her katana, looking completely unbothered. You can still back out, Krelvoth said to her, though his tone made it clear this was a courtesy he didn't actually mean. Admit that you made a mistake bringing that antique, and we'll start your training with appropriate weapons. No thank you, sir. I'm good. I genuinely couldn't tell if Dakota was brave or delusional, possibly both. Humans have that quality where those two traits kind of blur together. Gormath returned wearing a full Coalition combat suit, which was basically personal tank armor with shields. The suit itself could withstand direct plasma fire, explosive impacts, and, according to the specs, a small tactical nuclear device if you were standing far enough away. He activated the energy shielding, and a faint blue shimmer surrounded him. Rules are simple, Krelvoth announced. First to land 3 verified strikes wins. Lethal force is discouraged but not prohibited. Instructor override will prevent actual death, probably. Begin when ready. The crowd backed up to give them space. I found myself holding my breath, which is difficult when you have 3 separate respiratory systems. Gormath rolled his shoulders, testing the weight of his axe. The plasma edge hummed to life, glowing with enough heat to make the air shimmer. He outweighed Dakota by at least 400 pounds, had reach advantage, better armor, and a weapon that could, theoretically, cut her in half. Dakota bowed. Actual bowed, like this was some kind of formal duel from ancient Earth. Then she drew her katana from its sheath with a soft, metallic sound that somehow cut through all the ambient noise in the hall. "Whenever you're ready, big guy," she said. Gormath charged. Now Thex are fast despite their size, and in combat armor with servo assistance, they're even faster. Gormath closed the distance in maybe 2 seconds, his axe coming down in an overhead strike that would have split Dakota in half if it had connected. It didn't connect. Dakota moved. And I don't mean she dodged. I mean she moved in a way that made it look like Gormath was swinging at where she used to be before she'd already decided to be somewhere else. The axe hit the floor with enough force to crack the reinforced plating. Before Gormath could recover, Dakota's katana flashed out. There was a sound like singing metal, and suddenly Gormath's axe was in two pieces. She'd cut through the handle, right below the blade mount. The plasma edge sputtered and died. The room went silent. "Strike one," Dakota said calmly. Gormath stared at his broken weapon with the kind of confusion usually reserved for people who've just discovered their morning coffee was replaced with motor oil. Then he roared, dropped the useless axe handle, and threw a punch that would have knocked Dakota into next week. She ducked under it, stepped inside his guard, and her katana rang against his chest armor. When she stepped back, there was a perfectly straight line etched across his breastplate, scoring through the ablative surface layer. Strike two. Now Gormath was angry. He grabbed for her with both hands, using his superior reach and strength to try and just physically grapple her into submission. It was actually a smart move. Can't use a sword if someone's crushing you in a bear hug. Except Dakota wasn't there to be grabbed. She slipped to the side and her blade flicked out again, tapping against his helmet with a sound like a bell being rung. Strike three. Match. Gormath stood there, breathing hard, looking down at Dakota like he was trying to process what had just happened. There were visible marks on his armor where she'd struck. His weapon was in pieces, and he hadn't landed a single hit. The silence in the room was deafening. Krelvoth's scales had gone completely flat, which I later learned was the equivalent of a human's jaw dropping. All three of his eyes were fixed on Dakota. "That was," he started, then stopped. "That was luck." "Was it?" Dakota sheathed her katana. "Would you like to verify that, sir?" Oh, she didn't just say that. Nobody challenges an instructor on day one. Nobody. That's like showing up to your first day of work and telling the CEO his tie is ugly. Career suicide. But Krelvoth's eyes narrowed. I could see his pride wrestling with his tactical intelligence. Pride won, as it usually does. "You want to test your primitive weapon against me?" He gestured to himself with all four arms. "Against a veteran of 37 campaigns?" "If you're offering, sir." The other trainees were looking at each other with expressions that ranged from horrified to excited. The Mindweaver was actually taking notes. I was trying to remember if I'd updated my insurance information. Krelvoth walked to the center of the training floor. He didn't bother with a weapon. He didn't need one. His natural scales were rated for combat. His reflexes were enhanced through decades of training and some light genetic modification, and he had 4 arms to Dakota's 2. "Same rules," he announced. 3 strikes. I won't even use weapons, just to make it fair." Dakota bowed again. Then she settled into a stance that looked deceptively relaxed, her katana held at a low guard. "Your move, sir." Krelvoth moved like liquid violence. He was faster than Gormath, more experienced, and fought with the kind of precision that comes from making combat your entire life. His strikes came from multiple angles simultaneously, his 4 arms creating a web of attacks that should have been impossible to defend against. Dakota's katana moved like it was tracing patterns in the air, deflecting, redirecting, never meeting his strikes head-on but always just barely moving them aside. It was like watching water flow around rocks. Every time Krelvoth attacked, Dakota was somewhere else, and her blade was already moving to counter. They circled each other for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds. None of us were breathing. Even the Theks had stopped making noise. Then Dakota saw her opening. Krelvoth overextended on a particularly aggressive combination, and she stepped in close. Her katana moved in a precise arc, and suddenly there was a thin line across his chest scales. Not a cut, just a mark, but a mark nonetheless. "Strike 1." Krelvoth's eyes widened. He tried to grab her with 2 arms while striking with the others, a classic grapple-and-strike combo that was supposed to be undefendable. Dakota dropped low, letting his grab pass over her head, then rolled under his strikes. Her blade tapped against his leg armor as she came up behind him. Strike 2. Now Krelvoth was fighting seriously, no more holding back. He moved with the kind of speed and ferocity that had made him a legend. He was using techniques from a dozen different martial traditions, shifting styles mid-attack, doing everything possible to catch Dakota off guard. She kept pace with him, more than kept pace. She was predicting his movements, reading his body language, seeing attacks before they fully developed. And her katana was everywhere, creating defensive patterns that looked almost artistic in their efficiency. Finally, Krelvoth made his mistake. He committed too hard to a high strike with his upper arms, trying to force Dakota to raise her guard. She didn't raise her guard. She lunged forward instead, stepping inside his reach, and her katana's tip came to rest against the side of his neck, right where his scales met the softer tissue underneath. Strike 3, she said quietly. Match. They stood there for a long moment, Dakota's blade not quite touching his skin, Krelvoth's arms frozen in mid-strike. Then Dakota stepped back and bowed again. Krelvoth lowered his arms slowly. He was breathing harder than I'd ever seen him breathe. His scales were doing this weird rippling thing that I'm pretty sure meant he was experiencing multiple emotions at once and didn't know which one to settle on. Where, he finally said, did you learn to fight like that? My grandfather started teaching me when I was 6, Dakota said, sheathing her katana. He studied under the last living master of our sword school before the Unification Wars. I've been training for 20 years. 20 years, Krelvoth repeated. You've been mastering a single weapon for 20 years. Yes, sir. While the rest of the galaxy was developing energy weapons and combat shields, your people preserved ancient combat techniques. Some of us did, yes, sir. Krelvoth looked around the room at all of us, his scales finally settling into what I think was a pattern of respect, or maybe resigned acceptance. I have trained warriors from 14 species, he said. I have seen every modern combat technique, every weapon system, every tactical doctrine. And today, I was defeated by a piece of sharpened metal and 20 years of dedicated practice. He turned back to Dakota. What is your name? Dakota Reeves, sir. Well, Dakota Reeves, it appears I owe you an apology, and possibly a drink, several drinks. Do humans still consume alcohol? We do, sir. Good, because I'm going to need quite a bit of it while I reconsider everything I know about weapons training. The tension in the room finally broke. A few people started laughing, though it was more relieved laughter than mocking this time. Gormath picked up the pieces of his broken axe and stared at them like they might explain what had just happened. Krelvoth held up one of his hands for silence. I am an instructor, he said, addressing everyone, which means I am supposed to teach you. But today, I learned something. I learned that I had become arrogant. I assumed that modern technology had made traditional skills obsolete. I was wrong, he gestured to Dakota. This human just taught me that mastery, true mastery, of any weapon makes that weapon lethal, regardless of its technological level. She has trained longer with her blade than some of you have been alive, and now she is going to teach all of you what she just taught me. Dakota looked surprised. Sir? You will assist me in this training cycle, Krelvoth said. You will teach these warriors that technology is a tool, but skill is eternal. And perhaps you will teach me as well. I'd be honored, sir. Don't be honored yet. You still have to pass the rest of the course. I'm still going to make you bleed. Looking forward to it, sir. What happened next became something of a legend on Outpost 17. Dakota did indeed pass the course. Top marks, actually. But more than that, she changed how the entire program operated. Krelvoth started incorporating traditional weapon training alongside modern combat systems. He brought in masters from different species to teach their ancestral fighting styles. The program became about more than just learning which button to push on a plasma rifle. It became about understanding combat at a fundamental level, about the principles that remained true whether you were using a stone axe or a molecular disruptor. Dakota's katana became famous in its own right. Trainees would point it out when she wore it, which was always. Some of them started researching their own species' traditional weapons. A Vrilnathi warrior showed up one day with something called a chakram, which was essentially a flying circle of death, and that was absolutely terrifying to witness in action. The best part, though, came about 3 months into the training cycle. We were all in the observation deck after a particularly brutal day of exercises, and someone made the mistake of asking Krelvoth if he'd changed his mind about traditional weapons. He looked at his drink, which was some kind of Vrilnathi whiskey that could probably strip paint, and then he looked at Dakota. "Do you know what she did after that first day?" he asked. We all shook our heads. "I found her in the training hall at 0300 hours, practicing forms, just her and her sword, repeating the same movements she'd probably done 10,000 times before." I asked her why she was practicing techniques she'd already mastered. "What did she say?" I asked. Krelvoth smiled, which on him looked like a landslide trying to be friendly. She said, "Because I haven't mastered them yet. I've only been training for 20 years. We all sat with that for a moment. "That's when I understood," Krelvoth continued. "She didn't just defeat me with her skill, she defeated me with her philosophy. While I thought I'd learned everything, she knew she'd barely begun. That's not a human thing. That's a master thing." He raised his glass. "To Dakota Reeves, who taught an old warrior that there's always more to learn. And to her sword, which is apparently sharper than my pride." We drank to that. Even me, though I'm pretty sure the alcohol was technically poisonous to my species. Worth it, though. Dakota just smiled, that same patient smile she'd had when facing down Krelvoth on day 1. "You know," she said, "my grandfather used to say that a sword is just steel. It's the person holding it that makes it dangerous." "Wise grandfather," Krelvoth said. "He also used to say that anyone who underestimates you based on appearances is giving you a gift. They're showing you their weakness before the fight even starts." Krelvoth laughed at that, a real laugh this time, not the condescending one from before. "I gave you quite a gift that first day, didn't I?" "You did, sir. Thank you. I don't suppose you'd be willing to give me a rematch sometime, after you've had those 20 years of additional training you mentioned?" Dakota's smile widened. "I'd be honored, sir. In 40 years, I'll probably have figured out what I'm doing wrong with my stance." That became a running joke in our cohort. Whenever someone accomplished something impressive, we'd say they were halfway to figuring out their stance. It was a reminder that mastery wasn't a destination. It was a journey that never really ended. By the time we graduated from that training cycle, every single person in our cohort had passed. All of us, even me, despite being a hiver who was primarily designed for record-keeping rather than combat. We'd learned from the best, and we'd learned that the best didn't necessarily mean the newest or the most technologically advanced. Sometimes the best was a 5'4" human woman with a sword older than space travel and the patience to spend 20 years learning how to use it properly. I ran into Dakota about 2 years later on Station Gamma while I was coordinating supply shipments. She was between combat assignments, still wearing her katana, still with that same calm expression that suggested she knew something everyone else had forgotten. "Hey, Yax," she said, "how's logistics treating you?" "Better than combat training, that's for sure," I said, "though I still practice those forms you taught us." "Good. Even us non-combat personnel should know how to defend ourselves." "I heard Krelvoth has been telling your story to every new cohort," she smiled. "Has he? That's kind of him. He says you're the best warrior he's ever trained." "That's definitely an exaggeration." "Is it, though?" I tilted my head in the hiver equivalent of a skeptical look. "You defeated him on day 1 with what he called a primitive weapon. I got lucky. Dakota, you literally carved your name on his armor during a demonstration 2 weeks later. I was there. You wrote D. Reeves was here across his chest plate in perfect letters without scratching him." She had the grace to look slightly embarrassed about that. "He asked me to demonstrate precision striking." He asked you to demonstrate disabling an opponent. You turned it into calligraphy. Well, I wanted to make a point. You made several points. Very precisely spaced points. That spelled your name. We both laughed at that memory. Krelvoth had been so shocked that he'd actually kept that armor piece, scratches and all, as a teaching tool. It hung in the training hall now with a plaque that read, "Precision matters. Never underestimate dedication." You know what the best part of all this is? I asked. What's that? Somewhere in the galaxy right now, there's a weapons instructor about to make the same mistake Krelvoth made. They're about to underestimate a human with a traditional weapon, and they're about to learn a very entertaining lesson. Dakota's smile turned slightly mischievous. I certainly hope so, she said. Someone has to keep the tradition alive. And that, friends, is the story of how Dakota Reeves and her ancient sword humbled one of the greatest warriors in the Galactic Defense Coalition, changed an entire training program, and reminded everyone that sometimes the old ways persist because they work. Also, it's a story about not being a pompous jerk who mocks people before understanding what they're capable of, but that's a less fun moral, so I usually leave it out. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a drink to finish and about 40 more people who want to hear this story. I'm thinking of charging admission at this point. The therapy bills from those Vrilnathi's support group members aren't going to pay themselves.